Hello, my name is Vicki Molta, and this is You and Your Mental Wellness. Tonight I have a guest, Christine Meyer. Meyer or Mayer?
It's Mayer.
Mayer, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Christine Mayer. And before I introduce her and talk about what she does, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of childhood trauma on adult development. And I saw something that's coming up on April 6th at Quinnipiac University through the MSW department. And it's a clinical series about the relationship of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, to adult well-being, disease, and premature death. The ACE study progressively uncovers how adverse childhood experiences are strongly related to development and prevalence of risk factors for disease and health and social well-being throughout the lifespan. ACE is an in-depth retrospective analysis of over 17,000 adult members of Kaiser Permanente, matching their current health status against 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that occurred on average a half century earlier. It was found that adverse childhood experiences are surprisingly common, although typically concealed and unrecognized because of time, shame, secrecy, and social taboo. Adverse childhood experiences still exert a profound effect 50 years later, transform from life experience into organic disease, mental illness, and social dysfunction. Adverse childhood experiences are the most detrimental of the health and social well-being of the nation and of adult medical costs. So I thought this was really important to bring this up about how it's, that even 50 years can go by and a person can still be affected by childhood trauma. And but I wanted, second of all, I want to introduce, like I said, I introduced Christine Mayer. And there's a program at the PTSD Center where she works in New Haven. It's a renowned agency run by David Reed Johnson, a pioneer of drama therapy that addresses a childhood trauma in New Haven public schools called The Story of Miss Kendra. So Christine Mayer is the director of the ALIVE program of public health and social policy at the PTSD Center. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what's your feedback on ACE and on this, what I had just read?
I mean, ACEs is sort of a seminal study for anybody that does trauma work. So it was one of the first major mainstream studies with that number of people, 17,000 people, to kind of look at what is the impact of trauma over the lifespan, and not just what most people assume, which is that it would have mental health impact, but importantly that it would also have physiological impact. So the studies are not just whether or not the person is more likely to experience depression or suicidality, which it found, but also things like cancer, COPD, chronic health issues as well. So this was kind of like a big moment, not only for the mental health community, but also for the public health community in terms of addressing the impact of trauma on huge populations. So our work is based through a public health framework. The entire ALIVE program is looking at how do we, in a preventative way, through a public health sort of modality, address trauma, not so that it goes secret for 50 years, but that we're asking every child on a regular basis whether or not they're being hurt, and whether or not they're being neglected, and whether or not they've had something bad happen to them. So that when they're 50 years old, it will not be the first time that they're being asked that question, and so that we can intervene earlier. So that's the entire basis of the program, is very much in line with the original ACEs study. So
Right.
Yeah.
Now, is this a national study, or is it worldwide? Or this was a question I was going to ask you toward the end.
Sure.
But would you say it's particularly prevalent, the silencing of trauma in this country, or worldwide, or have they done studies on that yet?
Sure. So the ACEs study has been replicated in different places. So it has happened not to the same extent, but there's been lots of looking at other things that trauma events sort of correlate with in terms of health and mental health, not only in the US but outside. So the ACEs was specifically to this nation, but certainly trauma has an impact across the world. And I would suggest that most communities don't talk about trauma openly, out of fear, out of shame, out of taboo, similar to the words you used. And so I don't think it's an American problem. I think it's a bigger phenomenon than that. But we're here, and so I think the cultural context of America requires, a particular way to kind of cut through. And the Alive program is the way that we've chosen to do that.
So I just, do you think that there's a lot of emphasis on, success in this country and just over involvement with people who've achieved, the American dream or whatever, not enough of the underlying, that's what I
Sure.
think. It makes people feel like if they're not, making $1 million or whatever, or whatever idea of success is,
Right.
they don't cover I think you're right, the underlying, what's going on. People aren't, you're right,
Right.
people aren't talking about it.
Yeah, this is a little bit outside of my role in terms of the center's work, but my personal belief is sort of like that's the myth of meritocracy, right? Like that in the United States, the people who are successful because they have worked hard, as opposed to people in the United States are successful because they've worked hard, but also usually because they have had an easier road to get there. And that doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions to the rule, but in general, people that are under greater amounts of stress, poverty, racism, sexism, who live in particular neighborhoods, who've had different opportunities, are up against a much steeper hill
Right.
than somebody else.
Yeah,
And I think trauma is one of those factors. It's not the only one, but I think it's an important one and one we don't talk nearly enough about.
Right, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah,
So I just want to get into, you're a drama therapist by training.
I am.
So what does this involve, and have you worked with adults and children? Or?
Sure. So drama therapy has been around for about 40 years, a little bit longer than that. And it's an alternative way to be able to do mental health work. So people who are trained as drama therapists are also trained in sort of doing verbal psychotherapy, group dynamics. They get abnormal psychology, all of the same sort of coursework that you might get if you were training to be a social worker, for example. But in addition to that, they're given training of how do you use creativity, imagination, play, roles, metaphor, story, to be able to help the person be able to express what's going on with them and to be able to create a kind of creative container that can hold whatever distress they have. So people will use drama therapy in a huge range of different ways. The way we use it at the center and the way that I use it is for trauma purposes. More of my clients are kids that I use drama therapy with, but I definitely use drama therapy with adults, and in other settings have used drama therapy with adults exclusively. So yeah, it can be used with
So
anybody.
it probably makes people feel safer in a way, like if they're behind a role, or instead of having
Right.
to directly just say, oh, I was beaten up or sexually abused by my dad, they can use different role plays, and so it must be I think that's great. I think it's really important for people to feel safe to talk about their trauma issues. And so going a little bit further, tell me about
Sure.
the Alive program, and how and when did that start?
Sure.
A little bit.
So the Alive program is one piece of what the Post-Traumatic Stress Center that's run by David Johnson and Hadar Lubin, one of the things that they sort of have done over the years is think about what does it mean that we wait until somebody is very symptomatic. So either they've been hospitalized, the DCF has been called, the kid is falling out of school or failing out of school, has been arrested or suspended. The mental health field is set up to wait until the problem gets so big that there needs to be intervention. And that's in general. There are some exceptions to that rule as well in terms of preventative care in the US, but in general, that's the way the medical model is kind of set up, right? So at our center, the belief was we need to try something different, because what we're doing is waiting until there's a major problem, and then not only is our work greater to be able to help the person, but the child has lost years of their life that they'll never get back in terms of development, in terms of learning, in terms of building relationships, right? So the program actually began as a very small gesture to a school that was down the street from the center called Scholars, which is no longer in existence. But the principal there was Judy Puglisi, who we still work with now, who's a principal at a different high school in New Haven called Metropolitan Business Academy. And it began with, as the story goes, the legend goes, of David taking with him a wreath at Christmas time and saying, "Hi, we're your neighbors, and if there's any way we can help, let us know." And so over time, this relationship kind of built in order to be able to help attend to some of the problems that were happening with those kids in that high school who were having a hard time even getting there. So truancy was a major, major problem. And, we began with the relationship, and I would say the relationship is kind of the heart of our program, our relationship with principals, with teachers, with security guards, and with kids. There's a long history in New Haven of programs that come in and come out, and we sort of wanted to build long-term sustainable relationships with people. And the goal of Alive has been to basically be able to ask children on a regular basis what it is that they're up against, things that they're worried about, if they've had traumas or not, and to provide early services and interventions so that we don't have to wait until they get so sick that they end up as clients at our center.
Right.
We want to work ourselves out of the business of having clients at the center. We would rather be working with kids when they're kindergartners or when they're fifth graders and not when they're 45 and nobody's ever asked them what happened.
So this is really cutting edge, and do you think this is going to pretty much take over the rest of the country and
I mean, we would love it if it did. We're not the only ones
progressive
doing,
and it's cutting edge, and it's definitely could change the way the whole system is right now, because I feel like the system is broken, the mental health system. I think they're not really helping a lot of people, and they're falling between the cracks. I know a lot of people, I work in the mental health field, so I know a lot of people who've been really lost along the way, who experienced trauma when they were children, and it's sad, it's a tragic thing.
Agreed.
They just end up being very damaged, troubled, very fearful, and so I totally understand what you're saying. I think it's so important to intervene and into the lives of children when they're young, and that's why I believe so strongly in this program.
Yeah. I mean, I think from our perspective, look, I run Alive, so of course it would be amazing if it was alive. What's more important to me is the message behind it, and we're not the only ones who are doing this kind of work. We do it in our way, but there are others that are sort of waking up to the notion that we need to intervene earlier and ask regularly. So there's a whole movement within the pediatric field of having pediatricians, when kids come to see them, that they would be asked whether or not they've experienced any of the ACEs, any of the things that are on that list.
Right.
Again, as many people as possible, this would be the cultural shift that's needed. We're asking children regularly whether or not they were being hurt. That would shut down the number of people who were being perpetrated against. Because if that was being outed, and we really said, we're not going to stand for this anymore, and every adult who cares about a kid is going to ask and be asked regularly whether or not there's something that's on their mind and whether or not they're being hurt, the chances of people being hurt in the same kind of way that they are today, and the statistics are staggering, would reduce. And that's the hope for the program. So,
not just on a cultural level, but just even as an individual, for a child feeling like not alone,
Of
that
course.
they're not alone with, like, maybe being able to talk to somebody that they kept a secret from for inside them and living inside them, and so I think even that it must be a tremendous weight lifted off their shoulders to be able to feel like, wow, I'm not the only one that's going through this, and there's not something wrong with me, I'm not.
Right, it's not my fault that I'm being hurt, which many kids and adults grow up believing, right? And our society is sort of shaped in that way, where we ask, well, what did you do? Why was your mom upset before you got hit? Or what were you wearing? Or did you drink too much before you got raped, right? So our society is kind of set up, unfortunately, where the kinds of questioning we're doing is also indicating to the person, you're kind of at fault.
Right.
And that's part of what we're trying to sort of shift the conversation.
Because it must make them feel really riddled with guilt if they feel like they're
Absolutely.
like encouraging their perpetrator to,
Right.
you know, have sex with them or whatever.
Right,
and
right. Which unfortunately many kids grow up believing, right?
Right.
Because almost always, not always, but almost always, much more commonly, the perpetrator is somebody that they know. It's a family member, it's a teacher, it's a coach, it's a clergy member. Much more common for a child to be harmed by somebody that they know than it is to be harmed by a stranger, which again
Right.
is part of shifting the conversation. Yeah.
Now, I want to also ask you about the story of Miss Kendra and
Sure.
Miss Kendra's list.
Yes.
Because I know a little bit about that.
Sure. I think I should probably tell the story, Vicki.
Go
I think,
ahead,
I think we
yeah.
probably should. So the back piece here is that Miss Kendra is the frame that we use and the individual that we use to help start the conversation with elementary school students in particular, but also sometimes with high school students as well. And the legend of Miss Kendra goes like this, that Miss Kendra was a single mother who had a child, and she loved this child more than anyone or anything else in the whole world. And when the child was about 9 or 10, something bad happened to the child and the child died. Now, nobody really knows the full details. Some people say that the child was very sick for a long time and was in the hospital and then died. Some people say that something bad happened to the kid and somebody had hurt them. Some people say that the child was kidnapped or ran away and then passed away. But what we know is that the child died, and Miss Kendra, understandably, was devastated. This was, the light of her life.
Right.
And, she was in the middle of her own grief process, went to the doctors. The doctors told her, unfortunately, she couldn't have any more children. And she was just, beside herself, as we all are when we face loss, right? Incredible loss like that. And so Miss Kendra used to walk to work. And on her way to work every day, there was a school that was nearby. And she would kind of see some of the kids getting on and off the bus on her way to work. And it would make her happy to see them, but it also made her kind of sad and worried because she wanted to make sure that nothing was happening to these kids like what happened to her own. And so she decided that she needed to do some volunteer work as part of her sort of getting healthy again. So she contacted the school and said to them, hey, I'd love to come and volunteer at your school. Are there any opportunities? And they said, well, if you want to come volunteer, we need somebody to watch the kids when they get off the bus and greet them in the morning. Are you interested? So Ms. Kendra said, yeah, I would love to do that, right? And so she would go and meet them by the bus in the morning, and she'd be the first person that they saw when they got off the bus on the way to school. Sometimes she'd have cookies, sometimes she'd have a healthy snack, apple, something like that. But she always had a smile, and she always had a question. She'd ask them, how are you doing? How are things going? And she noticed actually that even kids that looked pretty upset, when she would ask them that question, they'd want to actually tell her how she was doing, and how they were doing. Not just sort of like, I'm fine, miss, but they'd want to tell her actually what was going on. So she started asking more and more questions of them, like, are you worried about anybody? How's everything going at home? Is there ever anything on your mind? Are you safe? And the kids loved that she would ask these questions. And for those that were having a hard time, she was able to get them some help. And for those who were doing okay, they felt comforted that somebody cared and would ask them that question every morning. So over time, all these questions became a list, which we now call Miss Kendra's list. And it's a list of things that shouldn't happen to kids. So no child should be punched or kicked. No child should be alone for a long time. No child should be hungry for a long time. No child should be touched in their private parts. No child should have to see other people hurt each other, right? No child should be exposed to gun violence in the neighborhood or the community. And so she came up with these lists, long list of things that shouldn't happen to kids. And followed those up by explaining that if those things happen to kids, there's going to be impacts. Things like they might get mad or angry for seemingly no reason. They might feel sad or depressed. They might have a hard time concentrating at school. They might want to fight too much. They might feel like giving up. And when they get older, they might feel like doing things like turning to drugs or alcohol or sex too early, that kind of thing. And so this list was created, and teachers who used to be kids that Miss Kendra used to greet off the bus grew up, and they wanted that list to remain. And so they started posting Miss Kendra's list up in their classrooms and asking kids if any of those things were happening to them. And Miss Kendra had a whole group of helpers, and I'm one of them, who would also go into classrooms to find out, is everything okay, and ask the kids if everything was okay. And the other thing that she did, which I think is possibly the coolest part about Miss Kendra, is something called a red bead. And so when a kid would tell her about something that they had lived through, and we all have lived through things, trauma or not, when a kid would tell her something that they had lived through, she would give them a red wooden bead, and she'd give it to them and say to them, this is for your strength. You've lived through something difficult, you're going to make it through, and this is to remind you every time you look at it that you're strong. And so these red beads, you know, every time they fell out of a pocket or ended up rolling in a backpack or show up in a classroom, would remind not only that child, but all the other children who saw them, and also the teachers who remembered the red bead, that were strong enough to survive this. So that's the legend of Miss Kendra, and that's kind of her deal. And we tell that story to kids because we think everybody should know that story about her.
Right.
And we tell that story so that people understand why we ask the questions we do, but also the fact that we can be strong enough together, especially in conversation with each other, leaning on each other, asking for help when we need it, expressing what's going on. We can be strong enough together as a community to be able to survive whatever our kids and whatever our families are up against.
So that must really, when they get the red bead, that must make them feel so proud of themselves for having
Absolutely.
gone through something really hard, and to be
Right.
recognized for that. And
Right.
you know, it just seems like in our society, you know, we're graded on, you know, how well we do in class and school, and spewing out information that's given to us, but to be rewarded for being emotionally strong, you know,
Absolutely.
for having lived through something and being recognized, must make them feel so recognized, you know, and you know.
Yeah, and we want kids to feel seen, right? And it could be that they're distressed because they've lost a pet, and it could be distressed that they've lost a parent. We're not sort of promoting kids to say something really awful to get a red bead. We're sort of suggesting that no matter what it is that you're living through, that there's hope, that there's strength, and that there's more strength in talking about it than it is about keeping silent. And if those things are happening, and this is ultimately our goal of the program, is not only the well-being of kids, but also at the end, freeing them up to be able to learn. Because if you come to school and you're upset about the fight that you've just witnessed between two family members the night before, or a gun going off outside of your house, right? We're not sure if you're going to be able to have enough food to eat tonight for dinner because money is very tight. It's going to be really hard to focus on math equations.
Right.
And we want kids to be able to focus on math equations because we
Yeah.
want them to be able to learn and be successful.
Right.
And the only way to do that is to help them be able to express their worries so that when they go to focus on math, math is what they can focus on. And
Right.
that's what we want to have happen.
So have you done, has there been any research coming out of it from, so this has been going on a few years now, so there are some people who are out of high school now, and have you been able to track them and find out what they're doing or what's happening with
Sure. So we haven't been able to track them yet in sort of like a systematic research kind of way. We have tracked them anecdotally, and we're still in touch with a lot of kids that have kind of gone through our program. And a lot of them volunteer with us with elementary school students. So we build in to the program as kids become high school students and later college students, or who are working, that they can return and give back to the program, which actually the kids like them more than they like us, first of all. I mean, I like to think I'm pretty cool, but like I'm not as cool as a New Haven high school student, let's be real. You know, and they also, the kids themselves who've graduated through the program, love the idea that they are part of changing things because they took in the value of the program for them. And none of them, you know, we haven't been around long enough that we've seen anybody from kindergarten all the way through high school. We've seen freshmen through high school. And so for them, part of the conversation is always like, what would it have been like in your life had you known about Miss Kendra when you were 6? And so they want to give back in that kind of way.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you work with from pre-K all the way through high school,
Correct.
right? So
Yep.
so obviously you reach them in different ways.
Yes.
You know, pre-K is obviously different than high school. So what are the
Yes.
different ways that you would do it with the pre-K? It would be that it just would be different.
Sure. So for the little guys, we do Miss Kendra activities in the classroom. So we tell the story of Miss Kendra. There's a list posted in every classroom, and there's a weekly classroom activity. So one of Miss Kendra's helpers will come in, one of our live staff will come in, and they will talk about one of the items on the list and open up the conversation to the group. And kids get a chance to actually write letters to Miss Kendra, and Miss Kendra writes letters back to the kids.
And there have been something like 12,000 letters. that
Even
have
more than that, Vicki.
Really?
Yeah, that 12,000 at the beginning of this year. So we're closer to
Wow.
like 13, probably by the end of this year, 14,000 letters. So a
Wow.
lot
And-
of letters
And
over
how
the
many
years.
how many schools in New Haven? This is all in New Haven, by the way, right? Or
No, actually
it's
not.
all over the state.
Mostly in New Haven because that's where the trauma center is based. But we have one school in Bridgeport and we have one school in New Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So we're in a bunch. We're in a bunch.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, this has gone so fast, and we only have about a minute left.
Oh no, Vicki! I have so much to talk about
I
the live
know.
program.
I know.
Okay.
We come
Yeah.
back definitely, but I just want to read a couple things that
Sure.
someone else said about trauma. I think it was another drama therapist that said trauma happens in silence and it has to be spoken for it to stop. To
Yeah.
speak the truth and not feel alone is transformative.
Mm-hmm.
And all conspire to keep things quiet and you said this, blame the victim. It's like the elephant in the living room.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's silence around trauma, and I think what you're doing is opening a door and opening people's eyes, and I just want to thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for
and
having
went
me.
by really quickly.
It did. It did.
And I just hope people, if they want to find out more about the PTSD Center, we can put something up on the screen for you to call to get more information about it. And I want to thank you, Christine, for being on the show, and
Thank you.
I want to thank Jeff and Abigail and thank the audience for watching tonight. So we'll see you next month.